Hey everyone. This evening, we're stepping onto the sun-bleached pavement of Route 66 in the summer of 1957. When the highway felt endless, the jukebox never stopped, and a tank of gas cost about 24 cents. Chrome and neon still defined America's roadside. Diners rich with the scent of bacon and coffee, motels flashing vacancy, and attendants greeting you before you even rolled down the window. It was the summer we drove forever, not because we had to, but because the road was where the country felt most alive. Route 66, fully paved by 1938, was already on borrowed time. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 had begun charting its replacements. If you'd like to hear more stories like this one, please take a second to like and subscribe. Now, settle in, close your eyes, unwind, and let the echoes of the past drift into the quiet corners of your mind. The first thing you notice is the heat moving around you, shaping the air itself. Inside, the diner had its own weather, cool, steady, carrying the faint sweetness of pie crust. Out here, the light feels harder, the sun deeper. Pavement sends up slow, wavy distortions that make the open stretch ahead look almost fluid, like it might dissolve if you looked away too long. The road lies in two clean lines, one trailing back to where you've been, the other reaching toward places that still feel more imagined than real. Nothing rises to block the view. The horizon stays low, the sky pressing down in a polished, unbroken sheet. When your shoes find the gravel edging the asphalt, there's a baked, dry rasp underfoot, each stone holding its own storage of sunlight. Now and then, a car slides by. First the faint rise of its sound in the distance, then a soft rush as it passes, and finally, a practiced fade until the stillness reclaims the space. Between them, there's only the quiet hum of unseen insects holding their ground in the weeds. That hush leaves room for the smells to step forward. The road itself breathes out a dense, warm scent, as though it's been simmering since morning. Beneath it is the sharper trace of gasoline drifting from somewhere up the block, and, so faint you almost miss it, the green dry whiff of sage growing in a patch of stubborn earth by the shoulder. Together, they belong entirely to this place and moment, fixing themselves in memory more firmly than any signpost. Along the full reach of Route 66, the heat itself changed character. From the weight of Midwestern humidity that sat heavy on your shoulders to the unblinking dryness of the high desert further west. Here in the middle, there's no softness to it. The sun works without pause, and the road, concrete in town, asphalt sprawling further out, holds that force differently, each surface imprinting it into the soles of your shoes. Tar seams snake away in darker lines, still a little soft at the edges, their edges catching bits of grit. A man steps out from the narrow strip of shade beside a doorway toward his 1956 Bel Air, idling at the curb. He moves with a fraction more speed than he'd planned, his shadow neat and close at his feet. The light catches the top of his head, and when he reaches for the door handle, his hand pauses just long enough to register the sting of the metal before he pulls it open. If you stand still, the scene works its way into you. The wavering air ahead tugs at your eyes. Heat climbs through the soles of your shoes. The scent of baked asphalt sits low, while from far off, the faintest murmur of tires says someone else is crossing the same stretch. A small pack of cars passes. Two new Fords and a dented pickup, and their trailing warmth hangs for a moment before thinning out into the ambient heat. Time here starts to measure itself in these arrivals and disappearances, wrapped in the cycle of engine hum, passing shadow, and a return to insect quiet. In those gaps, you find yourself listening for more. Sometimes a car goes by with its windows down, carrying not just the engine's tone, but something else, a spill of sound, thin and high, that catches just long enough to offer a voice or a steel guitar before it's gone. It's a reminder that the journey has another layer. Beneath the sun and the pavement, there's a thread of music knitting its way between towns. This wide, heated stretch is the frame for everything else that 1957's Route 66 held. The space, the pull forward, the way the air clung just so to skin and clothing. It's the backdrop against which every chrome bumper, every neon sign, every diner window stood out. Without it, those moments would have floated loose. Soon enough, the thought of a cooler refuge takes hold. You reach for the car door, knowing the air inside will carry its own heat for a while yet. Your hand finds the handle, the faint creak of the hinge marking the border between one world and the next. And here, with the road's grip still on your senses, you start to wonder. If you reached forward now and touched that chrome knob just a little to the right, what sound might spill into this moving, sun-struck space? The cabin holds a kind of stillness, broken only by the layered hum of engine and tires. The vinyl is warm against your back, and when your arm grazes the seat, it holds there for a moment before letting go. One elbow rests on the open window, warm air pressing your shirt sleeve flat against your arm. A hand moves to the radio, fingers finding the dial by touch alone. The first sound is static, thin, sharp, like wind-driven sand on a pane of glass. The dial shifts, the hiss bending in tone, and then, clean and sudden, a guitar spills through the noise. In an instant, the small space takes on color, filled by a voice you recognize. Maybe Elvis Presley or Buddy Holly, radiating that hopeful, restless energy that post-war America carried down its highways. The signal steadies, and the singer feels close enough to be riding along in the back seat. A few turns later, the guitar gives way to another kind of voice, slower, smoother, Patsy Cline, or someone like her, letting the notes stretch across the air until they feel as much a part of the landscape as the telephone poles ticking past the window. On a long stretch between towns, her voice can do more than pass the time. It can settle something unsettled in the car. The rhythm of song shifts with the reach of each station. Out here, a signal might come through strong over the plains, only to fall away as you climb toward higher ground or drop into a valley. Sometimes it's a bright piano and hand claps. Sometimes it's a steel guitar, pulling the sound low, slower, easier. The AM dial doesn't belong to one genre. It's a mix of horns, strings, raw rock and roll, light pop, and honky-tonk, turning the road into a moving cross-section of American music. Inside a westbound sedan, a family hears it all in real time. The father keeps the car steady, eyes forward. The mother glances back at the children, one hand on a picnic basket, humming to the tune. Two kids, their hair pressed flat from naps, latch onto the chorus and sing just enough to be heard over the tires. Outside, the desert changes its color with the sun's angle. Inside, the music threads the miles into memory. There's a kind of permanence in the pairing of song and scenery. You remember a certain stretch because of what you heard there. Buddy Holly matching the rhythm of white lines on the highway. Elvis rising over a ridge and staying with you until the land leveled out again. The music makes the road feel shorter, but in memory, it marks it more sharply. Not every reach for the dial brings back music. Some distances are so empty that stations vanish altogether, leaving only the mechanical sounds, the fan pulling air, the hint of a whistle in the antenna when the wind catches it right. It's a silence that can be as present as any melody, a silence that makes the return of music feel sharper, almost as if the right song had been waiting just for you to find it. The radio can lead you toward people as much as music. Far ahead of town limits, a local station might slip into your range, carrying an announcer's voice through the static. Time checks, weather for the next county, an introduction for the track you're already halfway through. It's a reminder that the lights ahead are more than just another cluster on the horizon. They're connected to voices, lives, and songs. For those who remember this way of traveling, it's often the music that plays back clearest. You might forget the name of a diner, but remember the harmony of the Everly Brothers filtering through its open door. You might lose the face of a fellow traveler, but remember the steady beat and guitar that carried you across a state line. In that way, the songs and the road were inseparable, each one helping to hold the other in place. As daylight starts to thin, the relationship between music and motion shifts again. The voices from the dash keep the miles from feeling too empty, but they also carry you forward into the growing dark. Out beyond the reach of the headlights, the land loses its detail. The road feels narrower, the horizon disappearing into shadow. The music holds you in a moving circle of light until some other kind of brightness appears. Something ahead, steady and man-made, able to pull a traveler in long before the tires reach it. After sunset, when night settled along the highway, the first change came in the way the light itself began to fade. The sky bled its color slowly, shadows stretching across the storefronts, and the road lost its sharp edges. On main streets, headlights carved shallow cones through the dim, leaving quiet patches of black between. Then from the roadside, a softer kind of clarity began to bloom. Lines and shapes forming in colored glass, humming faintly against the growing dark. Far ahead, you might catch the hint of a pink coffee cup, a curl of steam traced in glowing tubing. A little closer, a red arrow pointed toward the words air-conditioned comfort, spilling light across the gravel. Motels announced themselves in loops of script, sometimes with arrows marching in a steady chase that seemed to keep time with your own tires. Each one worked like a beacon, drawing you forward in the spaces between towns, where the dark closed in and there was nowhere else to stop. These signs weren't paper or paint under a bulb. They were hand-bent glass tubes lit from within, each curve shaped by someone who knew how to make it hold light evenly from end to end. Out here, keeping them working mattered. If the glow failed, the business might as well have vanished into the night. Many owners kept them on, night after night, not in competition, but because a steady light meant a steady chance someone would pull in. Picture the highway at full dark. The center line reflects back the beam of your headlights, but beyond it, there's only the dim smudge of horizon. Then, over the next rise, a sharper glow pushes through the black, blue and red lines shaping a cowboy 10 feet tall, his arm forever lifting a hat in greeting above the name of the motel below. The draw is less decision than instinct. Even before the driveway appears, your speed begins to drop. In one car, that summer, a boy leaned into the glass to follow every lit line, the brim of the hat, the boots glowing from the inside out, without knowing how those shapes had been coaxed from brittle glass. For him, it wasn't about the skill it took to build. It was enough that the dark had given way to this, a promise that the day's driving was almost done. Drivers came to read these signs the way sailors recognize lights along a coast. A steaming mug meant hot coffee at any hour. A key shape suggested rooms tucked behind a row of trees. A bright chicken silhouette meant a plate waiting just this side of midnight. They were a visual shorthand that worked without explanation, understood by anyone rolling past. From a mile away, the colors stacked against the night. Reds burned deepest, blues rode low and steady, yellow warmed edges blurred into the dark. A flicker here, or a brighter patch there, became part of the identity of a place, so much that you could picture an unevenly blinking O long after you'd forgotten the name of the town. Imperfections weren't a flaw. They were proof someone still kept the lights on, even where distance made every repair a challenge. By the time you reached the glow itself, the signs didn't just show what was there, they reminded you what you wanted. The coffee cup suggested the smell of it hitting a fresh pot in an air-conditioned room. A pulsing vacancy meant cool sheets and a quiet room, maybe with the sound of a pool pump murmuring outside. Even a roadside bottle shape promised a cold drink that would undo the dust of the day. The shift from darkness into neon light made the car feel different. You eased your grip on the wheel. The long silence broke, not entirely, but enough for other sounds to creep in. Music leaking from a doorway, voices carrying across a parking lot, the clink of something behind a counter. These signs didn't just advertise. They pulled you back toward human company after hours of no one but the wind for company. In 1957, on Route 66, neon drew the map as much as it decorated it. You could read the road's offerings clearly from nearly a mile out, the script both a guide and an invitation. Today, in some towns along the old highway, preservation groups fight to keep those originals glowing, knowing they're as much a part of the memory of the journey as the buildings themselves. Here, one of those signs fills the passenger side window with steady light. You pull off the road and let the engine idle before shutting it down. Outside, the air carries the buzz of a transformer overhead and the faint smell of frying food. The light paints the chrome trim and spills through the glass door ahead. Beyond it, there's a different kind of glow waiting. Warmer, closer, alive with sound. Part 4. The diners where they called you. Hun. Step inside, away from the hum of the highway. The cool air meets you first, followed by a quieter world thick with its own rhythm. The griddle's gentle hiss comes from behind a high chrome barrier, a sound so steady it could almost be mistaken for silence if it weren't for the low thrum of a jukebox somewhere in the corner. A cook's arm moves in an unhurried arc over the flat top, steam curling upward before it fades into the space overhead. Light bounces softly off stainless trim and the glass domes of pie stands. The counter runs in a slow curve, its red vinyl stools showing the marks of years' worth of elbows and jackets. Along the far wall, booths with deep cushions and metal-edged tables hold the glow, their shadows tucked neatly beneath them. Overhead, a ceiling fan turns without hurry, not cooling the room so much as keeping the scents in gentle motion. Coffee refilled more than once tonight, onions crisping at the edges, and the faint sweetness of pastry baking out of sight. Waitresses move sure-footed between booths and stools, uniforms in pale blue or green brushing against aprons. Name badges gleam just above their pockets, though most introductions happen with a casual hon that settles into the air like it belongs there. Coffee cups stay full without discussion, and instinct guides each fresh pour. The motion is seamless, coffee pot tilting, plates lifted from a tray, eyes never leaving the faces at the tables. Service is more than delivering food. It's the small art of knowing who's ready for a word and who's ready to be left to their plate. On the counter, beneath glass, pies wait for their share of the evening. Apple with sugar scattered across its crust. Lemon meringue crowned with soft peaks. Cherry sewn shut with a lattice. None looks exactly like another. Each bears the hand that shaped it. The menu speaks in plain language, the kind where prices are low enough that a traveler's loose change could cover a meal, coffee included. In 1957, along this stretch of Route 66, that wasn't a special offer. It was the quiet norm, part of a time when mom and pop businesses like this one built their survival on welcome, on fairness, and the steady passing trade from the road. Across the room, the mix of customers shows how the diner belongs to more than just travelers. A man in a dust-colored work shirt sits alone in a corner booth, his hat on the seat beside him, condensation sliding down a glass of tea. At the counter, a truck driver leans forward into his elbows, recounting weather trouble on the last leg to a waitress who nods at the right moments, drawing a thread of conversation from road to road. Nearby, a young couple, likely in from the farm, swap small notes about the week while splitting a slice of pie. These aren't planned meetings. They're the kind of encounters that happen because the chairs and the coffee and the air have been waiting long before you came in. The jukebox in the corner catches the light, its glass face showing rows of titles while its innards click and sigh at the push of a button. A metal arm shifts, finds its place on a small record, and a tune swells low enough to weave itself into the natural sounds. A fork tapping porcelain, a page turning in a menu. First-timers fall into the tone of the room without thinking. There's no need to raise a voice. Here, conversation finds its space naturally. For those on the road all day, a place like this offers more than food. It's where motion pauses, where you're reminded that sitting still has its place. For locals, it's a constant, a place to gather small bits of news, to nod at neighbors, to gauge the weather from someone who just came in from the next county. Its value isn't just in what's served, it's in the acknowledgement you get the moment someone sees you. And for the length of that stop, you are part of the room's quiet economy. Trade in news, in glances, in the comfort of a fresh cup. Paying feels almost incidental. You leave coins or bills light enough to carry in a shirt pocket, and in return, you've had a full plate, hot coffee, and a short seat in the small theater of everyday life. You might leave a little extra, earning a nod or a passing thank you that lands without ceremony. The register answers with its small muted bell, another sound that belongs entirely inside, One you'll remember the next time you pull off the road. The glass door opens again to let someone new in. A slice of outside air slides through, bringing the faintest rumble of a passing car. The person stepping in is greeted before they've reached a seat. The routine practiced, but never automatic. Highway or Main Street, these places run on the simple truth that someone, right now, is pulling off the road, needing what they offer. Your cup is cool now, drained to its final sip, and you edge it toward the table's corner. Around you, the same rhythm continues. The turn of the jukebox, the scrape of plate to counter, a laugh contained to the space of a booth. They're not moments designed to hold you, but they'll be here if you return. The door swings shut behind you, the night air settling close again. The windows show the work inside carrying on without pause. Out here, the road waits with its long, familiar sound, but the pause you just had is still warming the air around you. And somewhere up ahead, the next stop will bring a different kind of welcome. Out on Route 66 in 1957, pulling in for gas was more than a quick stop. It was the start of a familiar, unhurried exchange. You steered off the highway or Main Street and felt the tires thump lightly over a rubber hose stretched across the drive. A half-second later, a sharp mechanical ah-ding cut through whatever was happening inside the office. If it was near dusk, light spilled out under the station's canopy in a steady pool, catching on your windshield and chrome. The pump stood tall and slim, topped with round glass globes carrying their brands. Phillips 66 with its orange shield, Texaco's green and red star, Sinclair's gentle dinosaur curving above the name. In the west, Richfield's blue and gold eagle, or the wings of the Flying A, marked the stop. The styles varied from modest wooden fronts to clean modernist lines, but the feeling was always the same, a fixed point of light in the roadside dark. The attendant would appear almost instantly, the office door slapping shut behind him. He crossed to your car at a half jog, wiping a folded rag across his hands before tucking it into his belt. You rolled your window partway down, gave the amount you wanted, or simply said, "Fill her up," and he set to work. The handle slid into the tank with a practiced motion, the gallon counter beginning its steady click forward. While the pump did its work, so did he. One hand on the nozzle, the other hooking your wipers up off the glass in a single smooth motion. The rag came out again, dipped into a bucket of water near the pump, and with broad strokes he cleared away a day's worth of dust, grit, and tiny insect marks. For a driver who had been staring at a dimmer, dirtier horizon for hours, the sudden clarity of a clean windshield was its own kind of relief. Sometimes, without a word, he'd pop your hood and glance at the oil. A quick dipstick check, a raised eyebrow. Your call to top up or not. If the tires looked low, he would crouch with a gauge in hand, each faint hiss from the valve another small adjustment in your favor. In less than 5 minutes, the car was tended to in ways that kept the next stretch easier on both you and the machine. Often, these few minutes came with a scrap of local knowledge. Maybe you asked how far to the next town. Maybe he mentioned the stretch ahead had loose gravel, or that a better cafe sat just beyond the lights on the far side. For a traveler moving through unknown places, those small exchanges carried more warmth than the gas in the tank. They made you feel like a person in motion, not just a car passing through. A stop in the Texas Panhandle might have gone like this. A Ford sedan rolls in after dark, headlights cutting a pale swath along the station's wall. The attendant steps into the light, moves through the motions, glances toward the east when asked about Tucumcari. About 90 miles, he says, with that slight pause that suggests he's picturing every mile of it. Maybe a brief word about the wind, and the roads lift and sway over the flats. Just enough to make you feel you'd been handed a bit of the place to carry with you. By the time the pump clicked to a stop, the ritual was already complete. The handle returned to its hook. A slip of paper and change passed hands through the open window or at the counter. Sometimes there was the light tap of a hand on the roof, a wordless send-off. You'd pull forward, the bell sounding again under your tires, and the station would fold back into the pool of light in your mirror. The memory of those stops is stitched from small details. The smell of fuel mingled with cool rag water, the motors idle under the canopy, the easy authority of the attendant who knew your car's needs in a glance. It wasn't fast, but it was efficient in its own way. A check of the essentials, a word or two shared, and fuel enough for the miles ahead. Once you left town, the station's glow faded quickly against the dark. The hum of voices, the scrape of a bucket against concrete, the ding of another arrival, all of it dropped away behind you. In their place came the sound of the tires again, the engine steady, and the road stretching into whatever waited beyond the reach of the last street light. Once the last of the town's glow had slipped behind, the land ahead opened in a way that felt both calm and endless. Route 66, since its inception, had been laid out to pass directly through the main streets of small towns, stitching them together across states. Between those points of light, the road became a narrow thread drawn across wide space, asking for steady attention and quiet patience. Going west from Illinois, the shift in the land told its own story. In that state, tight rows of corn and acres of soybeans reached out in level lines, their greens clean and uniform under a high, open sky. The fields seemed to square the horizon itself, the occasional barn or farmhouse breaking the geometry. Further on into Oklahoma, the ordered fields gave way to open plains, grasses rippling in the wind, earth warm-colored and bare in places, the sense of scale stretching farther in every direction. By New Mexico, flat ground lifted into mesas and wide plateaus, their edges burnt red by daylight and cooling fast once the sun tipped down. Each region left its own lines and colors printed on a driver's memory. Along much of the way, fence posts kept rhythm with the miles. Silvered from sun and weather, they were constant even where the terrain shifted, the wire between them glinting when it caught the light just right and disappearing when it didn't. Here and there, a windmill stood off toward the horizon, the turning blades marking an otherwise still slice of landscape. These were the sorts of reference points you learned to keep in mind when the road ran unbroken for half an hour at a time. The soundscape between towns was stripped down to its essentials. The low rush of tires, sometimes the steady breath of air through open windows. In many cars, the radio floated in and out, holding on to one station for a few miles before static eased in and the search began again. Conversation slept in fragments, trading words only when they seemed to matter. Out here, distance wasn't a pause to be endured. It was the core of the day's travel. One car, in that summer's westward flow, held a driver with his left hand hooked over the wheel, the right resting near the sill of the open window. Now and then, his fingers beat out a half-remembered rhythm, following the music when it was there, keeping tempo with his own thoughts when it wasn't. The road ahead stayed clear long enough that he could glance sideways at a lone cottonwood, keeping shade for a few cattle, at a roof dulled by dust, at the far-off flash of another windshield moving under the same sky. In stretches like this, the nearest working gas pump might still be almost an hour away. The isolation had texture, but no edge. You could feel alone without feeling lost. The route stayed sure beneath the wheels. The horizon stayed firm against whatever the air decided to do. There were no streetlights to keep pace with, no stop signs to break your run, but for the engineered bends following the lay of the land. It was movement at its simplest, steady, and certain. Small breaks in the uniformity became their own markers. A low bridge over a creek, its guardrails bright in the sun. A weathered billboard whose colors were draining into the wood, still promising something just ahead. A shallow stand of trees signaling water, and, inevitably, the hint of human shape or shelter close by. Far off, something man-made might show itself, a geometry or color not born from the land, enough to draw your eyes forward. The changes in surface spoke their own language. Pavement under Illinois sun had a different tone through the tires than the black asphalt of the Texas Panhandle. Shadows looked cooler in the Midwest's early evening. They gathered a warm edge out in the high plains before shrinking back under New Mexico's sharper light. Air thickened in one state, thinned in another. The difference felt more through the skin than explained in words. Out across these reaches, arrival built slowly. A feature on the edge of sight would begin as a notch or a bright speck, then take on a clearer outline. Something named in your mind before you could read it. The moment when that outline resolved enough to measure against the sky was the moment you knew you'd have to decide whether to slow. These objects didn't blend with their surroundings. They waited to be seen. In the emptier runs between centers of light and sound, such shapes could feel like landfalls after open water. Some stood tall enough to announce themselves for miles. Others waited low, but broad across the ground. The kind that took shape all at once when you broke over a rise. Whether painted bright or left to bake into muted tones, their pull was steady. The line between the long hum of the drive and the brief pause of a stop lay somewhere ahead of your hood, no matter how far you had left to go. Now and then, something on that distant line would start to resolve with surprising speed. A structure or figure that was clearly made for the solitary purpose of being noticed from the road. Its size, its color, or the oddity of its form would take hold of your thoughts before it had even shifted from outline to detail. Soon, that was all the view ahead contained, and the miles between felt shorter for it. Out here, the highway sometimes made its own case for pausing. A low line of desert or prairie could hold steady for miles, then break with something that seemed to have dropped in from another world. Travelers in 1957 learned to spot these interruptions almost before they registered what they were. A shape or a color far ahead would stand apart from the land, pulling you toward it without a word. Some of the most famous stops had honed this art to perfection. In Arizona and California, the wigwam motels stood out well before you reached town. Concrete teepees arranged in tidy rows. each one a private room with the comforts of a standard motor court. From a distance, they looked like storybook villages planted along the asphalt, and the sight alone was often enough to make families lean forward in their seats. Along painted barns in Missouri, Illinois, and Kansas, you might catch bold white letters advertising Merrimack caverns, the promise of cool air and winding limestone passages working its way into your plans long before you reach the turnoff. In Adrian, Texas, a modest cafe proudly marked the midpoint of Route 66. Its claim as much allure for travelers eager to measure their progress as the pie and coffee served inside. And near Groom, Texas, the Leaning Tower of Britain tipped at a calculated angle beside the road, an oversized water tower made into a landmark you could spot half a mile away. The Big Texan in Amarillo drew another kind of notice, promising a stake so large it came with its own challenge. Even without taking it on, the neon cowboy outside was reason enough to pull in. The impulse to stop was a mix of curiosity and calculation. Out on an open run, anything built to human scale but exaggerated in size or shape could seem more welcoming than it might up close. Sometimes the reality matched the promise. Sometimes it was only a quick look and back in the car. Either way, the interruption was usually worth it for the break it gave the day's drive. Small clusters of roadside attractions played to different tastes. Trading posts, some with roots in earlier decades, sold Navajo and Hopi silverwork, hand-woven rugs, and pottery, along with rows of postcards and chrome-backed souvenir spoons. Others leaned toward bright blankets, cedar trinket boxes, and baskets of polished stones, just as ready to catch the eye of a child with a few coins as a collector with more to spend. A few stops doubled as reptile farms, displaying snakes or lizards in shaded pens, or offered tours of nearby caverns complete with staged lighting and gift stands at the exit. The aim was simple: give the traveler a reason to turn in, step out, and maybe carry something away. On one warm evening that summer, a westbound family steered into a gravel lot marked by a giant cowboy figure. Twice the height of the roof behind him, he stood in a wide stance, waving a permanent greeting toward the road. The children had the back doors open before the engine quieted, shoes crunching on gravel as they craned their necks to see his face. Their father framed the moment with his camera, the kids small at his boots, the figure looming above. In less than a minute, they were back inside, the snapshot on its way to becoming part of the trip's story. These stops worked because they tapped into the rhythm of the route. They appeared after long enough on the road that even a wary driver might welcome a diversion. They announced themselves from a distance, plenty of time for those inside the car to talk it over. And when done well, they offered more than a single sight. The feeling that you had stepped for a moment into a self-contained scene with its own rules, its own small window on the world outside the moving car. In 1957, Route 66 was as much shaped by these place markers as by the two lanes between them. They gave stretch to the day's memory, turning hours of motion into a sequence of stops, each with its own colors, names, and small claims to fame. A conversation about Holbrook could as easily start with the Wigwam Motel as with the town itself. A mention of Amarillo might bring up the Big Texan before anything else. They were anchors in a landscape where most things kept moving. By the time you pulled back onto the highway, the attraction had already done its work. A painted barn or a leaning water tower lingered in the rear view, while the car settled back to its cruise. Sometimes you carried a little proof with you, something bought inside, light enough to tuck away, but sure to show itself again long after the miles had been covered. And for many, those small things would come to hold the shape of the road as firmly as any memory of the drive itself. Picture yourself, years later, sitting at a quiet kitchen table. A shallow wicker basket sits within reach, holding a scatter of small, ordinary things that have somehow outlasted the decades. You draw it closer and lift the contents one by one. A ceramic ashtray with a black Route 66 shield pressed into its glaze. A bottle opener shaped like a gas pump, edges dulled where it knocked around in drawers. A palm-sized metal license plate stamped with a state name, now softened into near unreadability. None of them rare, none expensive in their day, but carrying the kind of presence that makes you pause. In 1957, you found these in the little shops that lined the slowing points of the road, wedged beside cafe doors, tucked into a motel's side room, or set just beyond a gas station's office. A brass bell hung over the entry might sound as you stepped in. Nearest the door often stood a tall wire rack of postcards, sunsets over mesas, main streets lined with chrome-grilled cars, photographs of neon signs in full daylight. The stiff cardstock still held a trace of warmth from an earlier hour outside. These shops compressed a traveler's idea of the region into a few square yards. Bracelets of polished stones, some marked as local, others not, were strung on elastic and set out in small clusters. Rows of hand-carved wooden figures, shaped into cowboys, coyotes, or eagles, faced front on narrow shelves. Leather belts, newly tooled and strong with the scent of tanning, hung in loose rows, their buckles catching the light. Closer to the counter, small boxes held glass paperweights swirling with color or shot glasses printed with town names. Much of it was light enough to pocket and cheap enough that a single coin could claim it. Route 66 had helped build a new kind of tourism economy, and along it, souvenirs were part of the quiet commerce binding together the road's service stops and travelers. The pause to choose was part of the draw. You could stand for long minutes, comparing a carved figure to a bracelet, weighing not their cost so much as which one might carry the strongest thread back to this moment once you were home. Sometimes the decision ended abruptly when someone called out that the car was ready or reminded you of the miles yet to cover before night. In one such shop that summer, a boy and his mother stood at a low counter. His hand traced the curve of a white ashtray rimmed with a red Route 66 outline, turning it so the emblem faced him. He thought of his grandfather's kitchen table, of how this would sit there without fuss. His mother laid a few coins on the counter. The shopkeeper folded the ashtray into a thin paper bag, and the boy carried it out, mindful of its weight against his palm. Certain items seemed to turn up everywhere. Postcards to send or keep, pins and embroidered patches to stitch onto jackets, leather keychains stamped with a name while you waited, maps thick with local ads that became keepsakes once the routes changed. Others were more accidental. A diner placemat saved from a child's place setting, a paper matchbook slipped into a pocket. Their modest prices made them reachable for nearly anyone on the road, so it wasn't just the well-off who could take a token home. Shopkeepers stocked carefully. Plenty of small, durable items that tucked neatly into a suitcase corner. The goods might arrive from regional suppliers, but the ones travelers remembered longest often came from nearby hands, with the backstory told while you stood at the counter. These pieces worked on two levels. On the road, they marked a specific stop. At home, they proved the journey itself. In a time when many stayed close to where they were born, such tokens could quietly say you had been somewhere different. Laid out on a table or kept in a drawer, they formed a patchwork record of towns and crossings, each with its own place name, colors, and associations. Over time, the objects carried traces of their origins. A faint scent from the wood shelves a postcard once leaned against, the lasting smell of leather from a belt, the way the glaze of an ashtray gleamed in sunlight, much as it had through a car window the day it was bought. Years passed, and the paper yellowed, keychains dulled, belts softened, paint wore thin where fingers always touched. The use didn't erase their meaning. It deepened it, linking the memory of the trip with the memory of the years since. They were small, tangible pieces of the road's culture, portable, easy to keep still while everything else kept moving. In those years, the roadside economy thrived on them. Shelves were full, and each stop offered the chance to take a fragment of the route with you. Standing in those shops, in the thick of summer, you could measure the journey not just in miles, but in handfuls of objects that held the air, light, and voices of the places you'd been. Now, with the basket nearly emptied, only a few tokens remain at the bottom, turning gently in the light. Each still recalls its source without effort. And while the summer of 1957 seemed full of open miles ahead, the road beyond each small shop's doorway was beginning to shift in ways that no trinket or postcard could quite hold. By midsummer 1957, there were hints that the road's long reign was beginning to edge toward its next chapter. From certain rises, you could glimpse a pale strip of concrete running across the fields or skirting a ridge, straight where 66 meandered, lifted above low places instead of dipping down to meet them. It wasn't part of the familiar route, and it wasn't built for pausing. Its purpose was to carry traffic past towns entirely, at a pace that left no room for storefronts, sidewalks, or the wave of a hand from the curb. The conversations that gathered around these new roads split in tone and temper. At a counter over coffee, someone might point out the relief. Fewer trucks on Main Street, less dust in the summer, more room for local errands to keep their own rhythm. But in the next booth, a business owner might wonder aloud what happened when the trucks and travelers stopped coming through at all. Their dollars carried in another direction. A bypass didn't just shorten a trip, it shortened the number of doors where travelers might step through to eat, sleep, or talk. Along some stretches, survey stakes appeared as if set out overnight, marching in measured rows over pasture or field. Strips of bright paint caught the sun at their tops, marking a line in the air that farmers and townspeople both could read well enough. You could work around them, but there was no missing the way they carved a quiet claim on ground that had been steady under the present road for decades. The reason, by then, was no mystery. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 had launched the interstate highway system. Tens of thousands of miles of new roadway built for speed, volume, and consistency. Route 66, like so many older arteries, would be bypassed, paralleled, or erased in sections. Crews were already measuring distances, surveying bridges, and laying out rights of way across Illinois, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The new highway's promise of faster travel came with the certainty that they would siphon away much of the life that had fed the towns along the Mother Road. It was a strange, doubled view for those who lived beside it. Each day, cars from 3 states away still rolled past their doors, and each night the neon still switched on without hesitation. Yet you could stand in the doorway of a shop or cafe and picture a quieter version of the same street, one where the only engines belonged to neighbors. Not every bypass was ready to open. Not every town would feel the shift at once. But the direction of the change was plain. One evening, a cafe owner leaned in the doorframe after the supper hour. The air inside smelled faintly of coffee and onions from the grill. Outside, a gap had opened in the passing headlights, long enough to make him notice. A mile or so north, the new route was on the way. And when it opened, many drivers would never pass his windows again. Here, that was not an abstraction. It was the difference between counting on travelers to fill the booths and hoping the few locals still in town would keep the lights on. The places where a bypass was already finished told the story in plainer numbers. Gas stations shut their doors within a season. Pumps left standing in the weeds. Motels dropped to a handful of guests a week. Rooms taken mostly by salesmen circling familiar territories. The town's hum became a murmur. It was easier to cross the street, sure, but there were fewer reasons to. By 1960, much of Route 66 westward was shadowed or replaced by the concrete of Interstate 40. Within 25 years, in 1985, Route 66 would be formally decommissioned, its long ribbon cut into local roads and renamed stretches, its history carried forward more in memory and preservation than in daily commerce. In the late 50s, though, that end still felt like something distant enough to push aside with a busy day's work. Travelers experienced the change differently. For them, the interstates meant fewer slowdowns for stoplights, fewer sharp turns in small towns, and more confidence in how far they could go before dark. For the road, it meant shifting from the most direct line between two destinations to something quieter, narrower, a choice to be made rather than an inevitability. The map would someday reflect that, with lines of newer ink overtaking the older one until only sections remained to carry the name. Yet through that summer, Route 66 was still whole enough to make the signs of change feel far off. The lights still bounced from polished fenders at midday. The line of the asphalt still rolled unbroken from one town to the next, taking in grain silos, mesas, windmills, and the long, low shape of hills in the west. The survey stakes and fresh grades of earth were just another part of the roadside sites, secondary to the people, the cars, the sounds. The first shadows fell lightly, visible, but narrow enough to step around. The road still had its voice, the steady drone of engines, the quick spike of a horn's reminder, the low music from open windows. The length of summer days made it easy to believe that voice would carry unchanged for as long as anyone could need it. And on an evening, when the air cooled and the streets kept their scattered glow, the road still felt self-contained and sure. Past the edges of town, darkness took over without hurry, the headlights carving just enough of what lay ahead. Whether or not you noticed the changes along the margins, the core of the highway's pulse was intact, quietly, insistently marking the miles like it always had. The summer of 1957 still held together in one long stretch. Every town along Route 66 kept its own rhythm, and the miles between carried their own quiet patterns. It was a road that served both as the means to travel and the purpose for taking the trip. Now picture the last light of day leaning across it. Pavement releases the heat it stored, the air cooling just enough to notice. Above, the sky slips toward blue-gray, while neon hums awake in slow flickers. Decades later, much of the route would be bypassed and decommissioned, yet preserved segments and small museums keep its presence alive. That summer's light was already part of history, even as it burned in the moment